Hello everyone, my name is Iman and I will be doing some case study practices with you guys. I will be focusing on the CAIE board examinations and basically I'll be going through the past papers and attempting the case studies that are part of section A of your paper 2 examination. So in this first video, I will be doing October-November 2018 paper 2, so which is version 2. And I really hope this series is useful to you guys. So what I like to do is I like to read through the case study and highlight or underline the points that I feel like will be important for the questions. So let's do that now. Let's read through the case study and together highlight the points that may be important. So the case study is called European Union to boost protection of steel industry as imports flood in. It's all about protectionism. So it says the EU is expected to strengthen its protection against steel imports. So that's the first point. Possibly as early as October 2016, as global trade war in steel intensifies and steel imports keep flooding in. So global trade war, I feel like is important. The EU has strengthened trade defenses over the past year, imposing anti-dumping tariffs on a range of steel products. These tariffs range from 18% to 25% for imports of steel from China. It is expected that these duties will be increased in October. EU data shows that 27% of steel imports come from China. The EU now has 37 anti-dumping and anti-subsidy measures in place for steel products, 15 of them against China. China, which produces half of the world's 1.6 billion tons of steel, has struggled to reduce its estimated 300 million tons of overcapacity. But the Chinese government denies its firms are dumping by selling steel at below the cost of production. It says global steel overcapacity is due to the collapse of demand after the 2008 financial crisis. Countries from Asia to the Americas disagree with China. The United States claims that Chinese government is subsidizing its steel industry, and this is a form of protectionism that gives Chinese steelmakers an unfair advantage in world markets. It has imposed tariffs of up to 450% on some types of Chinese steel. India has also imposed tariffs on steel imports from a number of countries, including China, Japan, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, and South Korea. So, overall, this case study is about how the EU felt it was necessary to protect against imports from China because they feel like China is using um, policies that are anti free trade and that give them an unfair advantage when it comes to the steel industry. So let's look at the data that they've provided as well. Now let's look at the tables. The first table says EU exports and imports of goods to and from China between 2010 to 2015. And the second table says EU exports and imports of services. So the first table is about imports of goods, and the second table is about imports and exports of services. Now, one thing to note is that the exports of goods is always less than the imports of goods to China from China. However, the exports of services outweigh the import of services from China. Okay, so now that we have read through the case study together, let's attempt the questions. Whenever you have a case study, the total marks will add up to 20, with the last one being the heaviest in terms of marks. So let's go through the questions one by one. Let's read the first question. Part 1 says, how does the EU's balance of trade in goods with China in 2015 compare with the balance in 2010? So comparing year 2015 to year 2010, what is the difference in the balance of trade? What is the balance of trade? A balance of trade is the difference in value between a country's imports and exports. It is measured by this formula. So the balance of trade is equal to the price of exports into the quantity of exports minus the price of imports into the quantity of imports. Look at table 1. We note that although the value of exports is increasing, it is always less than that of the imports of goods. So this indicates a deficit that is getting worse. So that is how you get your marks. First, you will have to say that the balance of trade is in a deficit. Okay, it was always in a deficit. It was in the deficit in 2010, and it also is in a deficit in 2015. But in 2015, this deficit has become worse. And that is how you will get both marks for this question. So let's look at the second part of this question. It says, how does the EU services balance in trade with China differ from its balance of trade in goods with China over the period 2010 to 2015? So it's basically asking you to compare the balance of trade of services with that of the balance of trade of goods. So we already decided that the balance of trade of goods is a deficit that's gotten worse. But let's look at the table and see what the balance of trade of services is like. Now, according to the table, the export of services has always outweighed the imports of services, and this is great for an economy. This means that at least when it comes to the balance of trade and services, the EU is in a surplus compared to the deficit that they're experiencing in the balance of trade of goods. So you have to compare the two balances. So you say the balance of trade of goods always in a deficit between the years that they're asking, the 2010 to 2015. However, the balance of trade of services is positive, which means it's in a surplus between 2010 to 2015. The main way you get both marks in this part is to compare both the trade of goods and the trade of services. You have to make the comparison. So the second question says, outline why the US would claim that subsidies to Chinese steelmakers gives them an unfair advantage in world markets. So the argument when it comes to free trade is that if the cost of producing uh, a product in one country is higher than compared to the cost of producing that same product in another country, then this country has lower efficiency. And therefore, country B should have a comparative advantage. Here, the US is claiming that the Chinese government uh, is subsidizing their steel production. Okay? Chinese government is subsidizing steel production. What this does is that it gives an unfair advantage to the Chinese producers. Okay? And it also supports inefficient production or producers of steel. And this is why it is considered an unfair advantage. So essentially, to get your marks in this question, you have to explain that if you give a subsidy to the producers of a firm, you're bringing down their cost and you're bringing it down lower than what it should be, and therefore you're giving them an unfair advantage. And the U.S. Claims that this is exactly what the Chinese steel makers are benefiting from. So this next question says that with the help of a diagram, explain how the imposition of import tariffs on steel will protect domestic producers of steel in India. Now, there's two ways to attempt this question. There's two possible diagrams that you could make. The first diagram is a relatively simpler one. It's basically talking about how if you put a tariff, which is a tax on imported products, you're going to cause the supply to fall. And now let's see that on a diagram. So initially, on this axis you have price, and over here you have quantity. And your original demand and supply diagram will look like this. So this is a D1 and this is S1. And so this is your original equilibrium with Q1 here and P1 here. Now, once the tariff has been implemented, it's going to cause the supply curve to fall to the left. And what this does is it drives up the equilibrium price. So your quantity falls and your price goes up to P2. So essentially what you want to say is that when a tariff is applied, then you're going to cause the supply to fall, which will cause the price of imported products to rise. And this leads to the demand for imported products to fall from Q1 to Q2. And how does this support the domestic suppliers? There will be more demand for Indian suppliers now, right? Because now the domestic suppliers will be supported as their domestic steel becomes more competitive. So let's talk about the other diagram that we could make. This may be considered more difficult, but easy enough to understand. So this time we are going to distinguish between domestic supply and foreign supply. So let's talk about the domestic supply first. This is the D1, and this would be S1 as before. But this time we're talking about domestic supply and domestic demand. So this would be your quantity if you were only to provide domestically, and here's your price. Let me label the diagram. Price on this side, quantity on this side. However, this time we're going to talk about the international supply as well. So the theory essentially says that the international suppliers are able to bring down their costs so much so that their price is at PW. So this would be world supply. And if this is the world supply and this is their price, the domestic producers cannot produce the same amount of quantity as these guys would. This lower price, domestic producers will only be willing to supply this much. And the demand would be this much. Do you see? This price is hitting the supply curve here and it's hitting the demand here. So although the demand for this product would be this much, the supply ends here. So the difference between the two would be imported. Now this is where the government steps in. The government decides to apply a tariff which will cause the price of the international steel to go up. So look at it, it's going to shift upwards. And so the new price would be PW plus tax. World supply plus tax. And so now the government has artificially driven up the price. At this new higher price, the domestic producers are able to supply a little bit more. So you see it's hitting the supply curve here. I'm going to drag it down, QS2, and it's hitting the demand curve here. Drag it down. So now the amount that is required for the people to import has fallen. Before it used to be this bigger amount, yes, this bigger amount from this area. And now, because the government has driven up the price of imported steel, the only amount that we will import is the difference between QD2 and QS2. Be able to explain, just as you did here, that if you apply a tariff, the supply of imported steel would fall because the price has gone up. So the demand for imported steel would actually fall. And again, the argument is that this protects inefficient domestic suppliers, um, and reduces the demand for imported products. Either of these diagrams are acceptable, but the main point that you should stress on is that the tariffs are intended to protect domestic producers of steel in India by giving them an advantage, and basically it causes the demand for imported steel to fall. So this next question says, explain who would lose, so who would lose in China as a result of the imposition of tariffs on Chinese steel. So obviously the first people who will lose out are people who make steel in China. Steel producers in China will lose out. Yes? And what will they lose out on? Income. Because now, because of the tariff, their steel has become less competitive, and therefore the demand for their steel will fall. And the demand for their exports will also fall, right? So this is why they will lose out. The second set of people who may lose out is the Chinese government. So the Chinese government may also suffer negative consequences because of this tariff. The reason is that there are significant costs associated with having to retrain labor that were previously employed in steel and having them being trained in an alternate industry. So cost of retraining, yes. Also, there's the cost associated with the spare capacity, because in the passage it talked about how there's a lot of spare capacity when it comes to steel, and now especially so because of the demand falling of steel. You can also talk about other supporting industries that use steel and how they will suffer as a result of the steel industries going down. So it can have a spillover effect on other industries as well. So you could choose to talk about this too. But if this is a 2-mark question, you don't need to go into too much detail. So pick wisely which one you would like to talk about. 2 says, explain who would lose out in the EU as a result of the imposition of tariffs on Chinese steel. Now, in the second part of the question, we're trying to figure out who would lose in the EU. So, who would lose in the EU? If a tariff is applied on Chinese steel, okay, this will cause people who were importing Chinese steel, so people in the EU who were importing Chinese steel now have to pay a higher price for this raw material. So their cost of production is going to go up, which is going to cause them to supply less, and this results in higher prices. So the first set of people who lose are the producers who use imported steel, steel from China, and ultimately the customers who have to pay the higher price because of it. Customers who pay a higher price due to higher cost of production, which is COP in this case. With reference to the principle of comparative advantage, discuss whether the increase in exports of EU services to China could justify free trade in the market for steel. So, the increase in exports of services to China could justify free trade in the market for steel. The first thing you will do is you will define comparative advantage. Okay, define comparative advantage. So, a country will have comparative advantage when they can produce something at a lower opportunity cost compared to another country. For example, the EU may a comparative advantage, have a comparative advantage in services, which is why there's a greater demand for the services. So the demand for these are high, okay? And it could be argued that China has a comparative advantage in steel, and that is why the demand for steel in China is high. Could these countries benefit from free trade? Yes, because that is the whole principle of free trade, isn't it? That if one country has a comparative advantage as compared to another, then the country should focus on what they're good at. And then they should trade so that they can both benefit from this specialization, right? So specialization leads to more efficiency, right? So your efficiency would go up, your quality would go up, and your prices would fall. Lastly, we should evaluate and conclude our answer. So evaluate and conclude. Because as you can see, the question asks you to discuss. So you need to present a little bit of the alternate argument too. In fact, the US is claiming that the Chinese government, because they're subsidizing Chinese steel, so the claims that Chinese government is subsidizing steel production in their country, okay? And therefore, this gives Chinese steel an unfair advantage, and they are able to dump their product into the EU market. Because of this very fact, it is debatable whether free trade should be justified in the market for steel. Because although the market could benefit greatly from comparative advantage theory and through specialization, however, because the Chinese government is giving their producers an unfair advantage, this goes against the argument of free trade, which is why the outcome is debatable.